This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for the 7th report in the Future Electric Utility Regulation series. Today, the authors of our new report, The Future of Centrally Organized Wholesale Electricity Markets, will present their perspectives: market operator, utility, environmental advocate, and consumer advocate. And then we'll take questions from the audience. The report covers 4 questions. Are today's market designs adequate to accommodate state public policy goals related to reliability, affordability, and resource mix? What are the market impacts of environmental regulations on the deployment of fossil fuel resources? What are the market impacts of integrating increasingly higher levels of renewable resources with zero marginal cost? And finally, are today's market designs adequate to acquire the flexible resources we need to better integrate increasing levels of variable resources at least cost? So first, I will tell you a little bit about the report series and then go over webinar logistics. This series of reports is designed to inform ongoing discussions and decisions by utility regulators, policymakers, and the electricity industry. We use a unique point-counterpoint or multiple perspectives format to present different views on the future of utility regulation and business models and the trade-offs in achieving a reliable, affordable, and flexible power system. The U.S. Department of Energy funds the series. 7 reports are completed so far, with several more underway. The next 2 reports will cover what incentives utilities have or don't have to make investments in grid modernization, and ways state utility regulators can foster competition for value-added electricity products and services while allowing utilities to play new roles. An advisory group of state regulators, utilities, and stakeholders help prioritize what topics we cover, provide guidance on how we cover them, and review the draft reports. We thank them for their help. So before I turn over the mic for today's presentations, here are a few housekeeping items. First, we're recording the webinar, and we'll post it on our website. And because of the large number of participants, everyone is in listen mode only. So please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. You can enter your questions at any time. We'll answer as many questions as we can following the presentations. And because we have several presenters today, you may want to direct your question to a specific author and just indicate that in your comment. The report authors will have about 6 minutes to present all together, and then I'll moderate Q&A with the authors. The report and webinar slides are posted at the website shown, and following the webinar, we'll post the recording. So today, our presenters are Craig Glaser. He is PJM's Vice President of Federal Government Policy, where he coordinates PJM's regulatory and legislative policies before Congress, FERC, DOE, and other federal regulatory agencies. Previously, Glaser served as Commissioner and Chair of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Jay Morrison is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. He leads a staff of professionals that represent NRECA and its members on matters relating to federal and state utility regulation, power supply, and delivery. And his colleague, Paul Braketon, is NRECA's FERC counsel and a Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs. He leads the organization's FERC-related advocacy efforts. Before joining the organization, he was a partner in the law firm of Duncan & Allen, where he provided a wide range of legal services for utilities. Allison Clement is former senior attorney in NRDC's Energy and Transportation Program. She was director of its Sustainable FEUR Project and NRDC Corporate Counsel. She's worked at law firms where she's advised utilities and independent power producers on FERC law. She recently started a regulatory policy consulting firm called Good Grid. And finally, Robert Mork. He's the chair of the Electricity Committee of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. He led a subcommittee of interested members to draft the organization's perspective for this report. Mark has served the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counsel since 2000 as Deputy Consumer Counsel for Federal Affairs, and he spends much of his time working for the effective development of electric wholesale markets under RTOs. He also serves as president of the Consumer Advocates of PJM states, and he's a representative of the public consumer sector on the MISO Advisory Committee. So following the presentations, we'll respond to questions that you post in the chat box. Please enter those questions at any time. Let's begin our presentations now. Craig?
Okay, thank you, and hopefully everybody can hear me. This is Craig Glaser from PJM, and it is great to be here. Monty Python used to say, now for something completely different. I really am going to start this with something completely different, because even though we're dealing with these heady topics of the future of organized markets, future of my employer in that sense, I'm much more short-term here. For many of us, this is over the lunch hour, or we just completed the lunch hour. So I'm going to start out using food analogies, because I've got food on the brain. So I want to start out with perhaps my most prized possession, my trusty kitchen blender. Why on earth am I showing you a picture of my home kitchen blender? Because, quite frankly, I view the markets as effectively operating the same thing as my blender. What does my blender do? I put in various ingredients, I push the button, and it spits out the recipe that I hope I achieved from reading the recipe book. If the recipe doesn't come out right, it's really not the blender's fault. Maybe I put in the wrong ingredients, or I missed an ingredient. And my basic message here is that the markets really, in their most basic form, operate similar to a market, similar to a blender. I put in ingredients saying, what are the customer demands? What's the forecasted demand hour by hour, day by day, for even looking forward, what's the customer demand for this product known as electricity? I put in an ingredient to ensure that the result is reliable, that all the generation is deliverable to the customers. I put in bids, price bids, cost-based bids. I put in recipe ingredients for limitations on the operating parameters of specific units. I also put in bids for, I put in a recipe for flexibility needed on the system and what I'm going to need an hour by hour, particularly if I have a certain amount of wind generation or other types of generation. I put those in, I push the button, and I get the most efficient and cost-effective solution based on those ingredients. We're going to talk a lot in this group about public policy, where public policy fits in, why aren't the markets doing X, Y, or Z in terms of promoting public policy. The market, like the blender, responds to the ingredients that are put into it. And unfortunately today, I don't have an ingredient because no public policy maker has given me a specific ingredient saying, before you come up with that answer, make sure you look at the carbon impacts. I don't have an ingredient that says, before you push that button, make sure that the outcome preserves nuclear generation, or preserves coal generation, or preserves biomass, or does any of those things. And I raise that not as an excuse, not as an apology, but I think as we go through the markets, and there are many things to criticize in the markets, I'll be the first to say that, but we ought not to blame the market for failure of our policymakers to pass policies that we want the markets to achieve. It's like a blender. If you give me that policy, you give me that ingredient, I'll put it in, and you'll get the most cost-effective, efficient application of that policy for delivery of reliable service to customers. So just, again, starting with a broad analogy, let me move to the next slide. Just can't go too far in any of these without a map. This is, in fact, the PJM system. We are really the largest RTO from a megawatt size, not by geography, but megawatt size, with 165,000 megawatts of load, 176,000 megawatts of generating capacity, serving 13 states and roughly 61 million people in the United States. Moving to the next slide. And I don't want to, and I've only got very limited time here, but we operate, just by way of tutorial here, a series of markets. And the markets, as you can see from left to right, are really segmented by time. Right now, we're coming up in the east on the 3 o'clock hour, and we will be taking bids for that hour in real time to provide service to customers between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock today, Eastern Time. But we're also, not that many hours ago, we just closed a market for bids for tomorrow. We are basically run a day-ahead market that locks in people's positions financially and gives us that much more price certainty going forward. We operate a capacity market, that is a 3-year forward market to secure resources, to ensure that we have them available for our forecasted reliability needs 3 years forward. We operate a financial transmission rights market, ancillary service market. As you get further to the right, you'll notice that there's a whole series of financial markets that operate off of our market. The PJM West Trading Hub is, in fact, one of the most liquid trading hubs in the country. Those are markets that are not regulated by FEUR, not administered by the RTO, but really depend and provide hedging instruments to load and customers. If we can go to the next slide, because here, 1 second here. Okay, so just a little bit about the changing mix. Again, I want to just sort of set up the basic facts. As you can see, we've had a sea change in the fleet. I've been in this business a long time. It used to take decades to change the fleet over, and yet we have, between 2007 and now 2017, looking forward, we have seen a substitution, about 24,000 megawatts of coal that is retired, and a substitution mostly of natural gas for that. If we can skip to slide 14, I wanted to cover 2 issues in the little bit of time we have. One is this whole issue of resiliency of the grid, flexibility of the grid that was mentioned, and the second, incorporation of state policies. Just on the subject of resiliency of the grid, just a little advertisement that didn't get into the slides because it's really just about to happen. Stay tuned because next week PJM will be issuing a paper that is a comprehensive look at these issues about how diverse can the system be, how much wind can the system operate on from a reliability perspective, how much natural gas is too much, etc. So we are really digging into this question of what does diversity really mean in terms of tracing it back to key reliability attributes. That's another topic. We can get to that in questions, but what I'd like to touch on in my remaining time is this whole question of incorporation of state policies. And although I said for the most part I don't have ingredients for carbon or saving nuclear or saving coal, I do get a fair number of ingredients that do find themselves in the market. States have passed renewable portfolio standards, and those actually do affect the energy market and are right now affecting the prices and demand and portfolio mix coming out of that energy market. We run GAT, stands for Generator Attributes Tracking System. We run a system of tradable environmental certificates that states can use that are really tied to the market results that they can use to enforce their RPS requirements. We have various public power models as well as fully integrated models that we have granted exceptions to in the capacity market. Those are covered in the next 2 slides. Fully vertically integrated utilities that can meet their full capacity requirements can receive an exception from participating in our capacity market. And public power, although it, like others, needs to participate in that market, in fact, we have worked through and negotiated with public power various mechanisms to allow sort of guaranteed clearing for new resources that public power may be developing, again, to explicitly address an issue about, quote, paying twice. And we provide exemptions for public power entities recognizing their traditional business models. And finally, for states, we have allowed them, if they want to get transmission built to meet specific public policy goals, we have built that into our planning process. So there's a lot already incorporated in state policy that finds its way into the blender. But if I can go to the next slide, I need to confess that this still remains the issue du jour. It's an issue we're spending a lot of time with, as a number of states, in this case most notably New York and Illinois, have passed specific requirements supporting individual units, in this case nuclear, in those states. And then the question comes, how do we accommodate those state choices to support a particular technology, in many cases actual specific units, generating units, and how do we do that without having it adversely affect the rest of the market? Because here's the rub when you're in a multi-state system. State A can have a policy, and we can incorporate that policy, but because there is an integrated dispatch, a single dispatch of energy or clearing of capacity, State A's policy choice isn't just limited to the borders of State A. By definition, it impacts the prices, the dispatch order in the rest of the market. So suddenly State B is feeling the effects of State A's policy choice, even if State B never wanted that particular policy choice. So you can imagine what this might mean for one state that wants to promote coal resources, another state wants to promote renewable resources. It's an integrated interstate market, so it gets tough when one state sort of has the effect of exporting its policy beyond its borders. So we've been trying to get very creative at PJM, coming up with some ideas to address that. I won't, in my remaining time, try to go through them, except to say that this is a live issue that FERC will be having a conference on. We've got a whole slew of ideas of ways to deal with this, and we intend to work with our states and our stakeholders to see what more can be done, sort of respect state policy decisions, but deal with that much more difficult issue of State A's policy choice is, whether they like it or not, exported through the single dispatch to State B, C, or D. Finally, let me close by saying it's helpful to keep in mind that the markets, particularly the energy market, which represents about 65 to 70% of the customer's bill, is a voluntary market. People tend to focus a lot on the capacity market. We're probably going to hear a lot about that. That is a much smaller part of it, incredibly important, but smaller part of the customer bill. The real money, the real customer impact is in the energy market, and there is a lot of flexibility available in that market for people to trade bilaterally, and as you can see, they do. Some of these other markets are more difficult because they are so much more based on reliability needs. Let me close at this point, last slide, to just say I look forward to the discussion on these issues. I've only touched on them briefly here, and I'm sure we'll have some great discussion in Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Just a reminder, please use the chat box to send your questions and comments at any time. If you want to direct your question to a specific author, that's great. Just do so in your comment. We'll address as many questions as we can following the presentation. So next we have the National Rural Electric Co-op Association presenting a utility perspective. Not all megawatts are created equal. First we'll have Paul Brakeman and then Jay Morrison. Paul?
Thanks, Lisa. Again, let me dispense with some of the formalities. I'm Paul Brakeman. I'm FERC counsel for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, or in acronym form, NRECA. I'm joined here by my boss, Jay Morrison, and Jay is our Vice President of NRECA's Regulatory Affairs and Environmental Units. And while Jay is my boss, I want to make clear that virtually all of the controversial positions in the report are his. I'm going to go through some of our high-level concepts a little, and then Jay is going to get into responding a little bit more specifically to the questions we presented in the report. Also, all of the opinions are those of Jay and myself, and they don't necessarily represent our membership as a whole. So as background, let me just go to this slide. NRECA is the trade association for all of the co-ops in the U.S., and co-ops are not-for-profit entities, and we're owned by our member consumers, and we constitute a somewhat unique sector of the industry. And as such, we face some unique challenges. As you can see on the map, there's more than 900 co-ops in the U.S., and all of which work very hard to provide power to about 42 million people in 47 states. And we've done it for the past 75 years, and we cover more than 75% of the landscape and represent about 12% of all electric customers. Our members include 65 what's called G&Ts, Generation and Transmission Cooperatives, and also about 840 distribution co-ops. And the G&Ts are owned for the most part by the distribution co-ops they serve, and they generate and transmit power to nearly 80% of those distribution co-ops, and those co-ops in turn provide power to their consumer owners. The remaining distribution co-ops receive power directly from other generation sources within the industry. Co-ops generate about 50% of the electricity they sell and purchase the remaining 50% from non-NRECA members. And for co-ops, both the distribution co-ops and the G&Ts, the focus has always been about what is best for our member owners. So that's why when Jay and I started to think about, the future of centrally organized wholesale markets, what they should look like, we settled on a very simple concept. Everything that happens in the markets, whether it's price formation or some rule design, the interest of the retail electric consumers must come first. And so it's that idea that really sets the foundation of our report. So again, let me just put it out there. Market rules and capacity procurement constructs, they need to be a means to an end. Better service and lower cost to consumers. So that leads us to that anything that happens with respect to the markets, anything that FEUR tries to do or does, it should always lead to those just and reasonable rates for consumers. Unfortunately, a lot of what we've seen over the last several years has been the markets really benefiting the market participants who have the most resources to devote to those administrative processes. And simply put, utilities exist. We know they exist to provide an essential service, and boiled down to its essence, the markets are supposed to exist to enable utilities to procure resources they need to meet that obligation more efficiently than they could have if they relied on their own investments. So it's supposed to be about providing customers with non-discriminatory access to the resources they need to serve those retail consumers at those just and reasonable prices. So the next question is, well, what do retail consumers want? And you might assume that the answer is pretty simple, but it's not. We know consumers want reliability. You get home from work, you want the house to be warm, you want the lights to go on, you want the hot tub to be 104 degrees, you want to fire up your 50-inch Vizio TV, you want to make sure that goes on. We also know that consumers want basically electricity bills to look the same this June as they looked the previous June. So in other words, rate stability, right? That matters. And we've also been seeing, as we all know, a shift by some, but not necessarily all, consumers wanting cleaner fuel sources, and then the states and regulatory bodies responding to that. So this is where I think we need to talk a little bit about the idea of how capacity is not really a fungible commodity. Not all megawatts are created equal, and there are all kinds of great policy reasons for preferring one resource over another, and for assembling an all-of-the-above portfolio of generation and demand-side resources. So here's our position, really. Federal policymakers should respect and honor the decisions that those LSEs, load serving entities, and the state and local regulatory bodies when they favor one resource over another, regardless of the resource. We also think that the market rules are supposed to protect prices under administrative capacity procurement constructs, and they should not erect barriers to meeting those policy goals. So I think, let's see, we're at slide 23. Let me go quickly through these. What else do we know? We should not take capacity surpluses for granted. We shouldn't be seduced into making short-term decisions. Long-term contracting and self-supply generation, those are things that are supposed to be encouraged and supported, and shouldn't be considered some kind of out-of-market subsidy. And here's another point I made earlier. It shouldn't really be about what the markets need. It's supposed to be about what the consumers need from the markets, not the other way around. And that comes out in our report, several parts of it. And then in designing the markets, it becomes a careful balance among a whole set of goals: resource adequacy, environmental, financial stability, safety, and it also becomes about what's right, what's best for that specific consumer, and it could be based on his or her local preferences. And so this is why utilities really need flexibility, and that's a key. Utilities need to be able to optimize their investments in ways that best serve the retail consumer, but it always goes back to the retail consumer, or it should always go back to the retail consumer. And that brings us to slide 28. I'm going to hand off to Jay to get into some aspects of the organized markets. Jay?
Thank you, Paul. Just had to take you off mute there. Hello, everybody. So, as Paul said, we start with the consumer. In the wholesale markets, we start with the wholesale customer. That's generally us. The utility is there to acquire the resources to provide their consumers with what their consumers want, in our case, our members. The consumers might express those desires through their buying decisions, through their letters to the utility, through their complaints to the utility, or through the ballot box. They might tell their regulators, we want more renewables than what we're getting. Their regulators then tell us, go get more renewables. So as a utility, we are obligated to find the resources we need to meet our consumers, our members' needs. Is that long-term reliability out past 3 years? Is that long-term price stability out for years to come? Is that greener power? Is that local power? Is that solar power? There's a lot of different things that, depending on where we are in the country, our members may want from us. And we go to the market to find those things. There are many things that the regulators to whom we are beholden want from us. And we go into the market to help us find those things. So what we expect is a market that enables us to find those resources that we need to meet our consumer preferences, whether those are expressed directly to us or through our regulators. So what does that mean the market needs to do? It has to reduce barriers to entry that raise the cost of that power or increase reliability risks. We want the markets to make it easier for us to find the reliable resources that we need and to bring in the new resources that we may need in response to new expressions of consumer interest or new expressions of regulatory direction. We want to reduce barriers to entry for new, innovative, and environmentally friendly technologies. If we're told to go get wind, we have to get wind. We want the markets to make that easier for us, not harder. And then to reduce barriers to exit for existing resources that may no longer meet consumer needs as well as new resources might. This is a tough one. This is difficult. Nobody likes their resource to suddenly be the resource nobody wants. Trust me, when the utility owns a resource and nobody wants it anymore, it is very painful to have to shut that resource down. For the cooperatives, the only people who can still pay for any remaining debt on that are our members. We don't like to see things go, but sometimes we have to. Sometimes the resources that we had no longer meet the needs that are being expressed by our members or by our regulators. Those the markets shouldn't require us to continue to pay for those when our consumers or our regulators are asking us not to. So let's then talk about whether the markets are meeting those needs. To do that, we have to break down what we mean by the markets, just as Craig did in his earlier presentation. There are two different kinds of markets in sort of big picture. There are bilateral markets where I buy and sell directly with other parties. And other parties are out there looking to me and to others like me to directly buy and sell. This particular paper was asked to look instead at the organized markets. These are the markets operated by the RTOs, the centrally operated organized markets. So those markets too, operating in parallel with and hopefully closely integrated with the bilateral markets, together have to be able to enable me to find what I need when I need it to meet the expectations of my consumers and my regulators. Now let's break down those centralized markets into different pieces, again as Craig did. There's the short-term markets. These are the day-ahead markets and the real-time markets, the ones that are every 5 minutes or 15 minutes. These markets, in response to the question asked, are doing a pretty good job. They are bringing down the cost of resources in real time. Are they meeting my needs to find the resources I need at lowest cost reliably for the next 5 minutes or for the next day? The answer is, for the most part, yes. We're going to quibble over a lot of details over those, but for the most part, those are working pretty well. They are allowing me to get open access at the lowest price to the best resources in real time. So that's a good start. Overall, nationwide, the markets are also working pretty well for the longer term. Now again, what we need to talk about is these are the markets combined, the bilateral markets plus the centralized markets, where there are centralized markets working side by side. Working together, for the most part, they're enabling us to acquire the resources we need in the long term to meet our obligations. But now let's talk about the different kinds of markets around the country. Take a look at this map. You can see that for most of the country, when I'm looking at longer-term investment decisions, what is the next capacity resource that I'm either going to build or contract for some period of time, in most of the country I am doing that bilaterally, and frankly that's working just fine. In MISO, the orange part of this map, I am also doing that mostly bilaterally. There is a centralized capacity market in which I can make relatively short-term, one-year exchanges. So if I'm long or I'm short, I've got a place to go where it's very easy to trade in the short term to make up those little bits of differences. That gives me an additional option as I, as a utility, am trying to manage my portfolio, and that is a useful thing. It's nice to have one more place in which to trade so that I can acquire what I need most efficiently. Now let's look at the gray section of this map. These are the eastern RTOs. This is Craig's RTO, PJM, New York, and New England. Until about 7 years ago, I would have said the same thing about these states as I said about the rest of the country in terms of it working well, in terms of it providing options. So that if I need an additional resource to meet a new regulatory obligation or an operational requirement or to meet a particular desire of my members, I could either go into the bilateral market or I could go into the centralized capacity market, and I could buy and sell in order to build the portfolio of resources I needed. About 6 years ago, the philosophy of the Eastern RTO markets changed. So rather than being about allowing the customers to find the resources they need and about allowing those who are long in resources or those who are independent power producers to compete to meet those needs of the customers, the markets instead became about economic engineering, about designing the system in order to try and create a price that would hopefully encourage enough people to build enough new generation to meet the needs of the market. Notice, that's no longer about efficient exchange. It's no longer about meeting customer needs. It's no longer driven by the customer. It's about economic engineering. That philosophy suddenly wasn't working. That led to the issue that Craig raised about the risk of paying twice. With the way they changed the markets for a short period of time, if I invested in the resource that I thought my consumers needed, either expressed by them directly or determined by my engineers or determined by the regulators who are responding to customer pressure, and that resource wasn't the lowest cost resource as calculated by the market monitor in one of those 3 Eastern RTOs, there was a risk that my resource would be mitigated and it wouldn't clear the market, and I would pay twice, once for the resource I needed and once for the resource that the RTO thought I should have. That is what has created that conflict that everybody is talking about between the RTO rules, between the capacity markets, and between state policies. I wouldn't talk about it as with state policies. I'd talk about it with consumer preferences. The market is interfering with the ability of utilities to acquire the resources that the customers want. Now, as Craig said, there was a lot of negotiation around this. There was a big to-do. There was a lot of litigation, a lot of unhappiness. In PJM, the members, through the stakeholder process, reached some temporary settlements that have, for at least now, allowed most LSEs to avoid this risk of paying twice for capacity, but it does create risks for consumers. It creates risk for the utilities. It creates a disincentive to entry. It creates a disincentive to exit. It creates an ongoing conflict with state policy. As Craig said, it's led to continued litigation as to what is the proper role of states versus the RTOs. And as Craig says, this continues to be the issue du jour, and there continues to be a risk in our members' perspective, the load-serving entities' perspective, the customer perspective, that the rules will shift much further towards the markets being designed as engineering tools to get results that the markets think they need, as opposed to tools to enable customers to acquire the resources that they want. Continue to be, rather than being tools that allow the customers to express their preferences and go out into the market to find the resources that meet those preferences. Now, some have said that the reason we need to do this is that regulators and utilities really stink at making choices, that the market is much, much more efficient at making choices than consumers, utilities, and regulators. And it's true, utilities and regulators have made a fair number of mistakes in the past. But relying on the markets doesn't eliminate the risk of mistakes, because the markets, when they are engineered to achieve a particular price range to encourage a certain amount of new generation to come in, are designed just as much to pick winners and losers as any RPS. A short-term market in which only gas can really compete, that's aimed at setting a gas level price, is going to get you gas resources. If gas proves to be the wrong choice in the future, then the market will have driven a mistake just as much as an RPS could drive a mistake. All right. So we are looking for ways to eliminate that conflict between the markets and the states, to eliminate the barriers to entry and the barriers to exit. And fortunately, if I can get this to move forward, the answer is fairly simple. We should go back to the philosophy we had 6 or 7 years ago, restore the mandatory capacity markets to their status as residual markets. Let's make the gray part of the map we looked at before look like the rest of the map in terms of the purpose of the markets, which is to enable, again, the customer to find the resources they want, and to encourage those who have resources to compete to meet the needs of the consumers most efficiently at lowest cost and with best service. And so this takes us then to the questions, if I still have time, Lisa, to talk about the other questions, which were what's going on with the portfolio. Obviously, we are seeing changes to the portfolio towards more variable resources, towards more local resources, towards more gas. This is having an impact on the operation of the grid. It's having an impact on the engineering of the grid. And it is going to be necessary for us to make some adjustments to the market design to make sure that the resources that we need to respond to those changes in the portfolio are valued and paid for. Let's go back to Craig's blender. A blender is a terrible tool if the goal is to meet long-term needs of a wide variety of consumers across 50 states, because every consumer, every state needs something different. Capacity is not a fungible product, but in real-time operations, the blender is what's working pretty well, except that in real-time operations, if what you really need to be doing is encouraging and compensating fast ramp resources, a blended price for a blended product doesn't encourage those resources to be built and to be operated. So we're going to need to be looking at changes in markets, changes in essential reliability services to make sure that we get those resources, operate those resources, and compensate those resources that are allowing us to respond to the new variable generation. The other big thing is the increased variable generation is changing the economics of the system as well as the operations of the system. Energy is becoming incredibly cheap because wind and solar have marginal costs close to zero, and economic costs for wind because of the production tax credit of well less than zero. Energy is dirt cheap. But power is not dirt cheap because we need lots of things to operate the system other than real-time kilowatt hours. We need all of the essential reliability services. We need wires. We need people. We need maintenance. These things cost money. They are not built into the cost of the energy. So who's going to pay for, how are we going to ensure people can pay for and will pay for the cost of the system above and beyond the cost of energy? And that's where we see the importance of long-term bilateral arrangements, whether that's 2 years or 10 years or 30 years. That's where we see the value of retail-consumer relationships. The consumers are getting the benefit. If the consumers are on the hook to pay for that benefit, we know we can build and maintain the infrastructure that we need to serve those consumers. So ultimately, the key is that we make sure that the markets are built around those consumers, not that the consumers are told what to do to meet the needs of the markets. Let's use the markets to help consumers find the low-cost resources that they need to build the portfolios that they need to manage their risk preferences, their environmental preferences, rather than forcing the consumers to change what they want in response to what the market thinks it needs. Thank you. And I, too, look forward to questions.
Thank you, Jay and Paul. Appreciate it. Reminder for the audience today, please use the chat box to send your questions and comments at any time. And if you want to identify that your question be directed to a specific author, you can do that. So next up, we have Allison Clement for Natural Resources Defense Council, giving an environmental perspective on these topics. Allison?
Thanks, Lisa. It's nice to be here today. It was quite an honor to be a senior attorney with the Natural Resource Defense Council's energy program. It's more of a dubious distinction to be a former attorney with the NRDC's energy program, but I did leave the organization at the end of last year to start, and I have started my own consulting firm out here in Salt Lake where I moved. But I'm going to be presenting on behalf of my NRDC colleagues today. Apologies for the raspy voice. So just quickly, the Sustainable FEUR Project is an organization, a coalition that lives in NRDC that represents a whole bunch of clean energy advocates to break down federal regulatory barriers to clean energy deployment. So what does that mean? It means that these three people who look like models for some sort of hip new lifestyle brand, but are actually the three attorneys that represent, who are the Sustainable FERC Project, along with Ralph Cavanna, who's the chair of the advisory committee for the coalition. They are active at FERC. They're active in the Eastern Interconnection RTOs, and increasingly in California and consideration of market development in the West. I think Jay's presentation really set me up. I'm going to kind of try and start where he left off with regards to what the changing resource mix and the increased amount of wind and solar power and other resources on the grid are doing to the system and the markets. And there is this increasing tension between the policies that exist in states at the federal level and the way that wholesale energy markets are designed. On this slide, only the first of these three bullets are really one of the drivers of the resource mix. State renewable portfolio standards have played a big role in getting more wind and solar power online. The rest of the policies that we look at down the line, if you think about New Jersey and Maryland attempts to procure gas generation, PJM's changes to its capacity performance rules, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, the New England stakeholders' attempt to redesign markets, and as well as the zero emission credit policies being considered an attempt to provide subsidies to increasingly uneconomic coal and nuclear plants. These policies are all a result of the changes in the resource mix that we've been experiencing, not the cause for them. But certainly, as you can see here, these changes are causing challenges every which way to Sunday, and it does feel a little bit like death by 1,000 cuts to current market design. And that's not to mention the demand side of the equation. Of course, as you know, DERs have been prolific in their emergence and their contributions to and their operational challenges for the distribution system, and there are real implications of that increased resource mix to the transmission system. FERC has embraced this reality and has put out a whole bunch of rules that have kind of started to break down the barriers to demand-side resources participating in wholesale markets. The proposed rule that exists right now that comments were just provided on that are intended to break down remaining barriers to storage participation in wholesale markets, as well as to formulate rules around distributed energy resources, it could be a really important starting point to look forward on market design. There are a few other places around the country where we've seen changes happening because of the emergence of distributed resources and their ability to implicate both the retail and the wholesale system. And even on the planning side, we shouldn't forget the connection that these resources are being used to avoid traditional poles and wires and substation upgrades, not just in the famous and exciting Brooklyn Neighborhood Program, which was the Brooklyn Queens demand side project, but even where I live in Utah, in a regulated state where the Public Service Commission approved Rocky Mountain Power's ability to use an investment in solar and storage to avoid more traditional upgrade costs. So stepping back for a second, what does this all mean? We really have to keep in mind that the policies that we are all talking about in the immediate and the state versus FERC tensions that we're seeing are not the drivers of a changing resource mix. We're talking about international market demand. We're talking about renewable portfolio standard policies. We're talking about customer choices that are going to cause the amount of variable energy resources on the system to increase regardless of what happens at the federal or state level. This week I heard Ron Nichols from Southern Cal Edison say that in the next few years, 15 to 40% of his load could leave for community choice aggregation programs. For those of you familiar with the Renewable Energy 100, these are huge corporations that are committing to going to 100% renewable energy. So we have these policy battles, let's remember that the disconnect between the resource mix reality and the resource mix around which wholesale capacity and energy markets were designed are different, and they don't work anymore. And so the papers that we've provided to you provide a lot of context, and they have to provide a lot of context because in this esoteric area of regulatory market design rules, statements can be made that aren't reality. We do, there's a lot of we don't know what's going to happen with the law, so we can't make any changes. I've heard that a lot in the West as an excuse for not moving forward on regionalization. But in fact, we do have the legal basis to understand that real change is possible in our wholesale market designs. So what's a market to do? And in my portion of the paper, we laid out 5 principles that should guide future market design and are intended to get us past this logjam of looking at what is this, these very important logjams of what does this buyer-side mitigation rule mean in this particular market, or what does this requirement that a resource be available in this particular market mean, and to try to step out of these big trees to look at the forest. I think Jay implied this throughout, and Paul throughout their presentation, but there's nothing sacrosanct about existing capacity market constructs. These are tools to an end. They are not to end, and it's important to remember that we can change them. So we're going to go through these 5 principles for the rest of my presentation. I really think that the keys are in principles 3 and 4, ensuring that wholesale markets provide the right set of services, and providing a platform that allows all technically capable resources to participate in the markets. The first principle is that we need to ensure that we facilitate, which means do no harm to, environmental policies. And although it might be tempting at this particular moment in history, in light of the lack of potential at the federal level to address the issue of climate change, we need to be careful and remember that FERC is not an environmental regulator. Let's be careful what we wish for in trying to get to the outcomes we are trying to achieve via FERC. Now, that doesn't mean we should reject the idea of a carbon adder outright, but it does mean that we need to look through the lens of the states and the other stakeholders who have interest in promoting our clean energy future when we think about what the important components of a carbon adder might look like. And here I'd say to Craig's earlier point that being part of a multi-state jurisdiction means that you're exporting energy policies and you're getting other states' energy policies. I don't think that's actually true in most cases. I think there's a distinction between the policies like renewable portfolio standards, which are each state's right to choose, or regional markets like RGGI that put a price on carbon and get added into energy prices in the ISO New England and PJM market. Those aren't, in effect, getting exported to the other states who don't want them. Where the troubles are coming in is when you have these policies that are being designed to address deficiencies in the market design, like the ZECs and the the New Jersey and Maryland examples that we've learned about in the past. The next principle is that we need to recognize and value all supply and demand side resources' contributions to resource adequacy, whether or not they're participating in the markets. There's 3 points I'll focus on. The first is load forecasting. Regardless of what the market construct looks like, let's figure out the accurate amount of energy capacity or any other service that the system actually needs. If there is energy efficiency and demand-side resources being developed in states that don't get counted in regional load forecasts, that means over-procurement, in addition to the over-procurement that Paul and Jay were describing. And PJM made a really big improvement in its energy efficiency forecasting and also in its related customer savings by capturing energy efficiency. ISO New England does a relatively good job of that. There's work to be done in other regions. And then when it comes to market participation, you have the issues of rules like PJM's capacity performance rules that end up discriminating against resources that don't meet certain performance criteria, even though they have capacity to offer. They won't be able to offer up that full capacity without penalty. The buyer-side mitigation issues and the attempts at addressing those that we've seen in a lot of litigation is another great example of where this is a problem that resources that are participating aren't getting counted in the market. And when I just want to call out on the buyer-side mitigation issue, then Commissioner Bay's concurrence in the NISO case, which exempts the demand-side resources from mitigation efforts, that these continuing attempts at using buyer-side mitigation to require new resources and demand-side resources to bid at a minimum offer level, as Commissioner Bay wrote, places the Commission in direct and recurrent conflict with the states. It ignores the pervasiveness of state and federal policies that support resources in one fashion or another, and it represents a significant intervention in the markets that raises costs to consumers. Okay, so we have these principles, and we know that we need to count all the resources, and we need to ensure that we're only procuring as much as we do. And so let's recognize we're in a transition period. You saw the PJM clearing resources and the rapid change in the decrease in coal and the increase in natural gas and renewables that have happened in just a short period of time. This changing resource mix is happening. And to Craig's blender analogy, we might not have an ingredient to price carbon or to prefer a certain resource, but we need new recipes. FERC needs to say to us, hey, yes, we have to ensure reliability in the near term, and these uneconomic resources are transitioning off the grid. But if FERC really wants to stay fuel neutral and look forward, the role of the markets is to facilitate that changing resource mix that is happening for reasons outside of the market construct, and to do so cost effectively and reliably. And so to get into this fighting which subsidy is legitimate and which resources are getting subsidies and how those affect the markets is hard. We're seeing that. FERC has this obligation to ensure that, just like it always has, that the drivers changing the market need to be facilitated as cost effectively and as reliably as possible. And so let's skip over trying to get this, square peg round hole of the current capacity construct and look beyond the currents of the markets. Look at how we define resource adequacy and what it means to have short and long-term reliability on our system, and decide what services FERC needs the markets need to facilitate this change. MISO has developed a ramping product. The California ISO has developed a flexible capacity product. You see in New England, the stakeholders proposing real market changes that might actually land us on the going beyond current construct side of the meter. And so these things are happening. The FERC, in 1996, determined to set a pro forma ancillary services, and recognizing the need to allow for regional variations and differences in regulatory constructs, it might be time for FERC to say, here's a set of services that we think the grid's going to need based on all the data we see about integrating renewable resources to the system. I think there's a question to Jay and Paul's point about whether or not that means that long-term contracts become more important, or that we find ways to value revenue streams so that resources are actually able to get paid for the services they're providing in the marketplace. FERC's upcoming technical conference is hopefully going to be a great way to get more specific in this discussion. Quickly, the kind of right glove to the left glove of that principle I just talked about is to provide a platform that allows all capable resources to participate and receive fair compensation in the marketplace. FERC's starting to do this with its proposed role in storage and DER aggregation, but there are deficiencies in that role, especially around figuring out the wholesale-retail market interface, allowing resources to value stack, if you will, to participate in both retail programs or retail markets and the wholesale markets. And I think it's also important to remember that we do have guideposts around the law and new interpretations of jurisdiction as regards the overlapping responsibilities for the states and the federal government. And I'll skip my last principle. I think it'll get covered in the next talk. And there's contact information for John Moore, who continues to lead the FERC project, and for me as well.
Thanks, Allison. Appreciate it. Just a reminder to use the chat box to send your questions and comments. Our next presenter is Rob Mork. He is chair of Masuka's Electricity Committee, and he is with the Indiana Consumer Council. Rob?
Thank you very much, Lisa. I am Rob Mork. I am in the coveted position of being the last speaker on a Friday afternoon in spring. So I am happy to be here. Thanks to Lawrence Berkeley and DOE. Let's see if I can figure out the slides. A little bit about Masuka. Masuka's members are designated by the laws of our respective states to represent the interests of utility consumers before state and federal regulators, and we are in 40 of the 50 states, and we're a very diverse bunch. In restructured states like some, in traditionally regulated states like mine here in Indiana, market and non-market, Democrat and Republican, states that are served largely by coal and states that are served largely by renewables. So what you'll hear from me is kind of an overview of what the group as a whole think. This is not my report. It is a joint effort by the members of the Electric Committee of Masuka and with some technical support for Synapse Energy Economics. I should say briefly that Masuka Electric Committee has regular meetings to discuss matters of interest. We're always looking for speakers, so I'll give a little plug that if any of you folks out there are interested in talking to our group, please reach out to me. Again, the views herein do not necessarily represent either my office or any other Masuka member. So, eyes on the prize. As consumer advocates, we're looking for the safe, reliable, and reasonably priced service. Our primary forum is our state public service commissions, although we recognize the importance of wholesale market design and all that goes into it. Our day job is our state public service commissions. So it is a challenge to cover all that we do here. But I want to emphasize that we're not just looking for sort of, I don't know, people have this image sometimes of consumer advocates as wild-eyed, bare-chested, bloodthirsty berserkers who want nothing but the lowest possible cost right now and to heck with the future and investment and so forth. I want to emphasize here that we do take the long view, consistent with reliable service, environmental standards, and the policy goals required by our federal and state governments. I want to address two overarching issues before I get to the specific questions. One is resources. Most of our offices are designed, really, and budgeted with an eye towards representing consumers in state proceedings. And I think that most, we vary a lot by state, but we do that pretty well. But organized markets are something new and more far-reaching. And we like the idea that RTOs and ISOs are built around the concept of collaborative development and open stakeholder governmental advisory processes and so forth. But it's also extremely resource intensive for many of our offices. But it's also important, in order to get good results out of those processes, you need to approach them in a collaborative way and not just say, the heck with this, we're just going to litigate it at FEUR. So I guess this is another plug that we do need help with our involvement in the process, just like our colleagues at the state commissions. The latest development in this for us, which we think has been extraordinarily positive, has been the creation of the Consumer Advocates of PJM States organization, which we call CAPS. It was created several years ago with some market manipulation settlement money from FERC. And we now have a line item in the PJM tariff that allows us to have an executive director and helps us engage collaboratively sort of up front in the process as it goes along, instead of just popping up at the end and saying, we hate this, it's too much money. A second overarching issue, and it's kind of related, again, states are very diverse. And resource decisions in the electric space are very long-term. It's not really like other markets. And there's this long-standing history of states being involved in being able to make their own resource decisions about taking into account such issues as reliability, fuel diversity, environment, economic development, a whole host of things. And we think that's really important and want to emphasize this. But we also understand that there can be a tension between that and having non-discriminatory, federally regulated wholesale markets. The cleanest, simplest designs tend to focus on just purely economic price signals, often on kind of a short-term basis. But that doesn't address always the full range of interests that need to be represented, as both Jay and Allison have said, to represent what consumers are really looking for here. So I think I'll go on to the first of the questions here. The adequacy of today's market designs. Frankly, we're not there yet. We've talked about how economic forces are driving some of the changes to the fuel mix of the future. Renewables are coming down in price. There's more natural gas, and so that's cleaner. But is that really great market design, or does it have partly to do with the windfall of having inexpensive natural gas from fracking? So we have issues out there of minimum offer price rules, which I guess I win the booby prize of having mentioned the acronym, which shall not be mentioned. But Allison talked a little bit about this in terms of buyer side price mitigation. Capacity performance rules, like PJM has recently implemented, which make it hard for seasonal resources for their full value to be recognized as capacity resources. Also, capacity markets. We understand the economic logic behind it, but we're talking about 3 years worth of looking out into the future on sort of purely economic decisions and based on things like the cost of new entry of natural gas generators and so forth. That it's all valid information in as far as it goes, but it doesn't address the full range of decisions that need to be made as we're thinking long term about what sorts of resources we need for the future. Let's see. So I think that it's important to add to today's market designs to keep working on those capacity issues that I've mentioned. Ancillary services of new kinds can also help, but again, making allowances for state public policy is essential in our view. Question 2, market impacts of fossil fuel regulations. We're looking at a new cycle of major capital costs, either to replace retiring coal resources with new resources of different kinds or retrofits. More renewables are coming, but they need backup for when they're not available or for ramping. As to coal capacity that's replaced by natural gas. Gas availability can be a great concern. So renewables do set low prices in some hours, and that has a substantial impact on the energy markets that needs to be addressed. But in other hours, the high operational costs of some of these retrofitted units, for example, can set high prices. And I guess our sector has a little bit of a pet peeve here. We hear all the time about how low energy prices are because of effective markets. But in many of these hours where energy prices are low, it's because somebody is paying a bunch of capital costs in other ways. So I think we have to be sure we understand what is being talked about. Third question, the market impacts of zero marginal cost renewables. Again, as we've been talking about, zero marginal cost renewables put downward price pressure on wholesale energy markets, which can lead to significant revenue erosion for baseload units. And again, we think there's more work needed on how energy capacity and ancillary services markets can work together to address these issues. Which brings us to question 4 about market designs to address flexibility. Currently, we think that the markets seem to be addressing this adequately at current levels of renewable penetration. But as intermittent resources become more common on the system, there are going to need to be additional refinements to the market and capacity and ancillary services. We do think that demand response is an important part of what we need to talk about here. It can be a valuable resource, but again, it needs to be evaluated in terms of its positive attributes that it does bring to the system, and not excluded because it's demand response. And as is in the case in PJM's seasonal capacity approach, and I hate to pick on PJM because they do a lot well, but in this case, it's keeping a resource that has real value when you need it, that can't get full credit as capacity because it's sometimes not available all year round. Wind's another example. So in concluding on this particular question, I think that our sector believes that you need to think about all the aspects of resources as they come, as they're added onto the system, both in terms of additional costs that may come along, in terms of ramping requirements and so forth, but also in terms of the benefits that they bring. So a couple more slides to gather up our conclusions. First, all resources should be able to compete and be paid based on the services, the full range of them, the costs and services that they bring to the grid. Second, that no resource should be excluded from wholesale market compensation mechanisms because they have different operating characteristics or receive support from utility or public policy programs. Third, all costs and benefits from each resource should be appropriately valued and allocated based on a transparent process with input from state participants. We think that's extremely important. And finally, my last slide, finishing out our conclusions, ancillary services are going to be an important part of what we talk about, we think. Fifth, the consumer interest in reliable and reasonably priced electric service is best ensured by ensuring that markets are efficient and transparent, and that we allow, again, for the full range of attributes that are valuable in each resource. Finally, our overarching issues about the importance of consumer advocates being able to participate effectively in the process, and also about the importance of respecting state jurisdiction in raising important public policy issues. I'll just close out by saying that we appreciate being included in this discussion, and that it really helps us do what we are here to do in representing consumer interests if folks come and seek us out and talk with us. We are looking for long-term solutions and not just the sort of cheapest thing in the short run. So we look forward to talking with you in the discussion section here and in the future as we work on these issues together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. So we're at the point where we have about 15 minutes left for questions. We've had a number of questions come in through the chat box. I'm going to start with this. In the report, Craig says that in a time of falling energy prices, regions that have capacity markets or traditional state regulation of generation, including rate basing of power plants, will be increasingly dependent on those two vehicles, capacity markets and traditional regulation or rate basing, to provide financial support for resources for system reliability. I want to understand, so that's what sort of Craig put in the report. I want to understand, first with Jay and Paul and then Allison and Rob, do you all agree, and how do you see this playing out? Jay or Paul?
Sure. I think traditional regulation is a valuable tool. I think capacity markets can be a valuable tool. I think the bilateral markets are going to be the place where we see most of the money coming in to support the new investment in longer-term resources. Certainly in the Traditionally regulated areas, the bilateral markets are backed up by that traditional regulation. So the LSE goes into the bilateral market, it is able to enter into a long-term deal because it has a long-term relationship with its consumers or its members. In the non-traditionally regulated areas, that doesn't mean the bilateral markets can't be the primary source for funding for the long-term investment. What it means is the states are going to have to find a way to put someone on the hook for reliability, for meeting state policy requirements, for acquiring the resources needed by their consumers. That may be putting the burden on the competitive LSEs and forcing them to compete for consumers to provide the best service in light of that obligation to provide long-term service. It may be putting the burden on distribution utilities like Cliff Hamal has suggested. It may be by simply threatening much bigger financial penalties if they don't come forward with adequate resources. Putting that burden on somebody will allow the bilateral markets to work the way they should, even if there isn't traditional regulation. But if we're going to make long-term investments, somebody has to make a long-term commitment. That might be through traditional regulation. It might be through completely rebuilt capacity markets that look longer term. But I think it's the bilateral markets personally.
Allison, do you want to comment on whether you think capacity markets and rate basing is going to play a greater role in a time of falling prices?
I guess that the question is, what are the options? If those are the only options and the capacity market remains kind of in the East an undifferentiated blunt product, then yes, they're going to have to continue to rely on it, and it's going to cause problems. I guess the role of the long-term bilateral contracting, we've seen that on the kind of corporate buying side with regards to renewable and on all renewable purchasing, but looking forward, for various economic market risk reasons, the tenors of power purchase agreements are getting shorter. They're not 20, 25 years and nice and cushy. They're getting pushed down, and because in some cases the buyers as well want shorter terms. So we're talking about 7 to 10 year terms for these agreements. What happens after that? And that's the idea of if we shouldn't have to artificially prop up capacity prices in order to ensure that the values that resources can provide to the grid get monetized somehow. And that's where the question of needing new products to either be convoluted to or to supplant the existing capacity contract is important.
Thanks. Rob, do you want to have a quick comment on that?
Yeah, I could just add a little bit briefly. I mean, it seems like a lot of the problem is with things like, you've got low energy prices, so the money has to come from somewhere. But it seems like some of the attributes of some of these kinds of resources are that, they need more flexible kinds of backup. And so providing kinds of products, new kinds of ancillary services that help with that seems like it should be part of the solution.
Great, thanks. We have a question directed at NRECA, which is, even if we shouldn't rely solely on wholesale power markets to create balanced electric resource portfolios, can't those markets serve other useful functions, like optimizing short-term dispatch? And as Craig suggests, can't we have both utility-based resource procurement and efficient wholesale markets?
Yes.
That's great. You should stop while you're ahead, right?
Yeah. We've been clear that we think that where they exist, the energy markets have done a pretty good job of ensuring efficient, low-cost, reliable dispatch. The markets have done a good job of providing open access to the transmission system. There's arguments about how good the transmission planning process has been, but there's certainly a role there for the RTOs and the centralized markets. The question is, are we relying on the markets to be the source of revenue and the sole incentive for new investment? And I think the answer to that is no. But otherwise, there are definitely good roles for the centralized organized markets. They're not necessarily right for everywhere in the country, but they do have value where they are.
Hey, Lisa,
and I hope we didn't give off the other view that we're totally opposed to. That wasn't the intent.
Lisa, this is Craig Glaser. If I could just go back to the
Sure.
prior question. First of all, I think Rob and Allison hit it on the head. This whole question of needing to be more reliable on other markets, be they ancillary services or capacity, in a time of falling prices, it's just a fact. I mean, it's a fact. It's just the math. As you get more and more renewables on the system, which have zero fuel costs by definition, you're going to have to back them up more. Times when there's cloud cover, times when the wind is not available. So that's going to require the construction of gas units or other types of units that may not run a lot, but in the hours you need them, you're going to really need them. And they're going to be up and down, and the cloud cover will pass, and suddenly you won't need them anymore. So that's how you come up with the revenue stream to track that kind of needed investment is really the challenge. I mean, Rob is definitely onto something that we've been thinking about in terms of ancillary service markets. The capacity markets will, by definition, become more important just because you have to fund these type of resources. Are there other ways to do this thing? Absolutely. But it is going to become more important, not less. And I will just leave with one other comment, and I appreciate Jay's comments, but 6 years ago, before we had these capacity markets, things were not so great. We had prices that were either on a ceiling or on a floor. We had generation that we were paying capacity for, but it wasn't deliverable to a particular location. So I was compensating a unit in the middle of Illinois, yet I needed the capacity in New Jersey, but I had no system to compensate for them. I didn't have any kind of forward signal. So we didn't just do this on a whim. There were some real reliability challenges we were facing, New England facing, New York facing. And Jay's map, which is a great map, but if I did a map of restructured states versus fully integrated states, I would posit to you that map would look exactly like that map that Jay presented with regard to states that have moved to capacity markets and states that haven't.
All right, let's move on to some other questions, though. We've got lots of questions here in very little time. Thanks, Craig. Here's actually a question for you, Craig, and then Jay and Paul would like you to chime in. Do existing energy and capacity markets properly reflect and offer tools to hedge potential fuel price risks? And how might these tools be modified to better capture these long-term risks? So first Craig and then Jay and Paul.
Right. A lot of the risk mitigation comes in the tools on the chart that I show. There's a whole bunch of financial hedging tools that are available. They really don't operate per se in the RTO markets. Those are instruments that operate and frankly are regulated by the CFTC. So those hedging tools exist. They depend on the market prices and the market signals, but that is its own set of markets and hedging tools.
All right, let's have a quick comment from Jay and Paul, and then we can move on to other things.
Sure. There are multiple ways to hedge fuel price risk. Financial instruments, gas forwards, gas strips are only one way to do that. The other way is to own a portfolio of resources that includes resources that don't use gas. And that's where it's important for the utilities to be able to put together a complex portfolio. And that's where those things like the minimum offer price rules start to create philosophical threats to the ability for the utility or for the state to make its own decisions about what it values as opposed to simply what clears the market.
All right, we've got another question I want to get to. The commenter says, ERCOT and SPP function just fine without capacity markets. Isn't the answer to make sure that the energy and reserves markets provide the price signals needed to drive bilateral contracting? doesn't that leave regulators and utilities free to engage in whatever bilateral contracts they want to engage in while still preserving the integrity and effectiveness of energy and reserves markets? And I think this was directed at NRECA.
Paul, you want to take that one? Oh, Paul seems to be stuck on mute. The answer is yes. SPP and ERCOT seem to be doing fine. They give folks a sense of what it is they are going to be seeing because the energy prices give you a sense of that. They do great long-term studies so that you know what's out there, you know who's said they're planning to close, you know where load is likely to be going. You make judgments based on that in terms of your own construction or in terms of entering into bilateral arrangements for resources. So that can work fine. Capacity markets can also be a useful tool on top of that if they continue to permit people to make their own choices as to which resources they want.
All right, let me see if I can get a yes, no, or no comment. Those are your three choices, speakers, on the following question. Leaving the capacity market aside, does each speaker agree that large regional energy markets improve efficiency, reliability, and the system's ability to integrate more variable resources? Yes, no, or no comment. Let's start with Craig.
Since I run these markets, I probably should take a pass on that, and I'll let the customers speak.
Okay, let's go to Jay or Paul.
Not hearing Paul, I'm going to come up with a different option, which is it depends.
Okay,
Am
well,
I
that's
off
fair.
mute?
Now you are, Paul.
There I am. Yeah, they can. How's that?
Okay, they can. It depends. All right, Allison?
I'll agree. They can. It's yes plus.
Okay, and Rob?
And this is Rob. I'll be slightly different. They should. I mean, you know, okay, theoretically, they should definitely be able to do that, and I think that, you know, on a lot of things, I think they're fairly successful at it.
All right. I'm going to ask a really hard question with 3 minutes left. What do our speakers think the chances are for a region-wide price in any of these markets for a policy preference that might be established? If, say, all states in the region can agree on how, you know, what the policy preference is and how to calculate it. And are there any alternatives?
This is Craig. I'll say we have, and I had that in my last slide, time didn't permit, but we are looking at sub-regional approaches. We've got a lot of ideas in this area, and stay tuned for more.
Anybody else want to respond?
This is Rob, and if I heard the question right, I think the problem is that those facts rarely align quite so neatly.
Agreed.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, you know, there aren't perfect solutions to this, and I think that's one of the traps we tend to fall in. That, you know, part of the appeal of some of the capacity markets that you have in the East Coast is, you know, this idea that you have they're a complicated set of rules, but there's sort of a finite one with mathematical formulas, and then you arrive at at a result. But the result tends to change, you know, year to year, and it doesn't, you know, always include all the externalities that and preferences of customers. So it's hard to figure this out, but I think we can do better than we do.
So we have a question. I think this will have to be the final one. You know, there was a lot of talk about what markets maybe shouldn't be used for, and maybe how, you know, in some ways they've been slowing some adaptations to new resource mix. But the question is, on a positive note, what are some of the proactive changes that market operators can make and are making in the short term to accommodate these broader changes underway in the resource mix? Craig, do you want to take that first?
Yes, in the limited time, we're very interested in energy storage, and energy storage has actually been very attracted to the PJM market, where we're compensating people for the flexibility of that resource. That's a promising field. There also are promising fields in energy efficiency and demand response as well. I think we've only scratched the surface in those areas. Anybody else want to respond?
Sure, this is Allison. I agree with that, and PJM's done some really great work on integrating energy storage. It's, you know, define the service. Each region needs some amount of flexibility. And there needs to be some reliability standards around that flexibility, and define that ramping product, and define maybe it's the same or maybe it's a different resiliency product, and then get out of the way and let resources come and provide those services.
All right, I'm so sorry that we're out of time. Anybody want to have last dibs here? All right, well, thanks so much. I think we could have gone on another hour with questions. Thanks to all of our presenters today who did a terrific job. For more information on the series, go to the website shown here. A recording will be posted shortly of this webinar, and we look forward to your participation next time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.